My name is Araceli Montero, and on behalf of the National Park Service, I'd like to welcome you to this year's Dissonant Voices. Um, every year, the Dissonant Voices workshop reflects on the untold histories of this land. And today, I look forward to addressing the rich and complex history of the Philippines through today's workshop, Speaking to the Filipino American Experience. The day is actually going to be framed by that wonderful essential question that we see in the back of the room by the food, by the table with all the food. That's why we put it there. So we made sure you saw that today, which is how can personal stories and cultural symbols of diaspora communities address the impact of colonialism? And so we'll be focusing on that essential question for the duration of today. And as you can see from your schedules, we have a filled day of meaningful inquiry-based presentations, curriculum frameworks, an exhibit walk, which is a real treat, I'll tell you, and a relevancy component and a panel discussion at the end of today. So as you can see, we have a very full schedule. Don't worry, we did leave time for you to have lunch today and breaks. But because we do have a full schedule, we ask that you please be mindful of time today, because we will be starting right on time after every break and after lunch today. Today, I'm pleased and honored to be partnering up with Rene Ciria-Cruz, who will take us through the background issues of immigration, identity, and nationalism. So without further ado, Rene, please come on up. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you for this opportunity I'd like to thank the Asian Art Museum and the National Parks for this opportunity to present some aspects of the history of Filipino immigration to this country. And necessarily, my presentation will touch on some aspects of Philippine history, American history, and most significantly, the history of Philippine American relations. I will be using a PowerPoint, but mainly as an outline for myself and for you. To begin with, what you've been hearing are strains of our national musical genre called the kundiman. Literally translates into if ever or if not, which means if ever you will love me, if you won't love me. That's the literal translation for that genre. It's an amalgam of Malayan tunes and Hispanic tunes. But if you go to Manila right now, nowadays, you'll barely hear this genre because Manila and other urban centers of the archipelago, which we are, popular culture is mainly a hybrid of American, Korean pop, and other Western popular styles, which has given us the distinction of being called the Latinos of Asia, because we don't really share a lot of cultural traditions from the mainland Asia and even parts of Southeast Asia. Anyway, my presentation will take us through. It's easier to remember the history of Filipino immigration if we have through these starting points: the Spanish-American War, the Second World War, and the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet bloc. I italicized the Second World War because I've been asked to concentrate mostly on that aspect of Filipino immigration to the United States. So I will just touch on as fast as possible on the first starting point and on the third, and go and concentrate on the second. As many of you already know, the first American venture into big power politics or imperialism was during the Spanish-American War, when the American ship USS Maine accidentally, it turned out, blew up. But the yellow journalism, mainly led by the Hearst corporations, started a jingoistic campaign that led to the American incursion into Cuba in the guise of helping the Cuban nationalists fight against Spain. And it's the same justification for the American incursion into the Philippines in 1898, which was started by the victory in Manila Bay of Admiral George Dewey, in which he annihilated the Spanish fleet. But instead of leaving, as the Americans had promised the Filipino revolutionaries who had been fighting against Spain, the United States stayed and claimed the Philippines as a part of its so-called benevolent assimilation. What followed was what we know in the Philippines as the Philippine American War, but which was being popularized in the United States history books as the Philippine Insurrection. The war was in part, a big part, a protest against the sale of the Philippines by the United States for $20 million, in which it really had no right to sell to a nation that had no right to buy from a nation that no longer had the right to sell, because the American occupation of the Philippines took place on the eve of the Filipino revolutionaries' victory against Spain. The Spanish forces were mainly concentrated in the walled city of Manila and were surrounded. In any case, what followed was the American colonization of the Philippines. It was a formal colonization with a colonial government, with American governors general sent to the Philippines to govern the country. What also followed was a campaign, as I said, of benevolent assimilation, which meant that the United States, to distinguish itself from Spanish colonialism, established public schools that were much better than the Spanish colonizer ever established. Also, public sanitation and better administration, mainly a secular state. And among the thinking classes or the intelligentsia in the Philippines, even though they fought during the Philippine American War, they immediately embraced the influence or the power of the United States, mainly because in comparison to the Spanish colonizers or Spanish colonialism, which was a dying colonialism, the United States represented a modern, beefy kind of imperialism. Besides, English was the main language of the Industrial Revolution. And Filipino intellectuals always wanted to be on a par with the advanced cultures of Europe and of the world. So what followed in the Philippines was a movement among the intellectuals called Sajonismo, or Saxonism, or Americanization. And within a generation, 20 years, by 1920, English became the preferred language of the upper classes. And also, in the public school system, that was what was taught. So English became the medium of law and medium of instruction. But more importantly, we could go back, you could ask me questions about this period later, but what this also started was the first wave of immigration, Filipino immigration, to the United States. First off, a few hundred so-called pensionados or students, Filipino students, were sent to the United States to be trained in American colleges and to go back to the Philippines as essentially civic personnel, bureaucrats of the colonial administration. Most of them went back to the Philippines, but the first real wave of immigration in the big numbers was around 1903. when the Hawaii Sugar Planters Association recruited around 200 workers in the sugar plantation. And then this increased to the point that between 1903 and 1928, there were 1,686 workers. And there's one estimate that the first wave of immigration was 150,000 between 1907 and 1930, that mostly in Hawaii. And this first wave of immigration, many of the workers found themselves on the California West Coast. Let me just proceed with this. Where am I? There. Oh, I missed that. Okay. Backspace. All right. So by 1930, there were about 45,208 Filipinos. Some of them, some 30,000 in California, 3,000 are working in Alaska, and 93% of them were males. The recruiters preferred single males, and so there were very few women who were able to come during that period. The consciousness of the first wave, the Philippines is an archipelago, so that what was consolidated during Spanish colonialism was mainly the state, which was mainly Hispanic soldiers and Hispanic friars. The nation in itself, the ethno-linguistic consolidation was not really taking place until the Philippine Revolution of 1896, when finally Filipinos began to have a consciousness of as Filipinos. Okay, but even then, the spearhead of this 1896 Filipino Revolution against Spain considered themselves mainly Tagalogs, or the main Tagalog-speaking areas of Luzon. Okay, so the consciousness was the national consciousness was fairly fragile when American colonialism came in, and that was why it was so easy to kind of like accommodate American influence, especially that it represented modernism. In the United States, the first wave were not discriminated as Ilocanos or Visayans or Tagalogs. They were discriminated as Filipinos. So that also helped, among the immigrants here, help consolidate the consciousness as Filipinos, even though their associations may be still limited to provincial associations, to regional associations as Visayans or Ilocanos. There was a lot of remnant Masonic influence because of the influence of the Masons during this anti-Spanish Revolution. So you will find in the first wave organizations as Legionarios del Trabajo or Caballeros de Dimasalang. These are all Filipinized names of Masonic lodges. By 1930s, however, because they were mainly agricultural workers, single agricultural workers, first wave also came under the influence of American left-wing trade unionism. Around this period, the American Federation of Labor was mainly a white labor movement that didn't really accept non-whites as its members. The leftist-led Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, started a counter-movement and started organizing non-whites. And this is where a number of Filipino agricultural workers became part of the trade union movement. The most militant of them also became members of the Communist Party of the United States. Now, Okay. As I said, most of the features at first, mostly they are itinerant bachelors that follow the harvesting and canning seasons on the West Coast. They had no citizenship rights. They were considered Filipino nationals in the United States, meaning they're not quite citizens, but nationals because the United States governed the Philippines. It's kind of like the Puerto Rican situation, you know. But they could come in freely if they could afford it by themselves, or they could come in freely as recruits of the Hawaii plantations. Because of the anti-miscegenation laws that prohibited the marriage of with white women, they mainly were bachelors, and their main outlet socially was the taxi dance halls, where they could dance with white women. And this provoked racist attacks, as could be seen in that picture, which is in Stockton. The headquarters of a Filipino organization was bombed, and there were also anti-Filipino riots. As a result, few were able to establish families. Don't get me wrong, there were families that were able to be established based on a few women who were able to come in, but for the most part, there was a very small second generation of this wave, and so that the community, on the whole, would be considered a bachelor society. Now, the American national status of Filipinos ended with the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934. What this act did was to promise independence to the Philippines within 10 years, in which case the Filipinos were no longer considered nationals of the United States, but were foreigners, and therefore could no longer freely enter the United States. And immigration to this country was limited to 50 a year, with the exception of Hawaii. Hawaii could still continue to recruit members, and also the workers in Hawaii were prohibited from going to the mainland. Okay. There is this act, which promised independence to the Philippines, was precipitated by pressure over the growing presence of Filipinos in the United States. It's a racial response. It's a racial reaction to the growing non-white presence, especially in California. There was also pressure from the racist trade union movements, trade unions, and pressure in terms of economic interest by American raw material producers such as tobacco, sugar, because of the free entry of Filipino agricultural goods to this country. They depressed the prices of American-produced raw materials. The U.S. government offered $300,000 for the voluntary repatriation of those who wanted to return to the Philippines, but only 4,000 took that offer. Let's see. I keep going, getting ahead my outline. Okay. Now, this is where I'm going to concentrate most of my presentation. The Second World War. Why this precipitated the second wave of Filipino immigration. When the Second World War was declared by the United States against Japan, the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt integrated the Filipino troops in the Philippines into the United States Armed Forces of the Far East in preparation for defense against the Japanese. Meanwhile, uh, in the United States, the Filipinos who were already here, of draft age, the first wave immigrants of draft age, were encouraged to enlist in the U.S. Armed Forces. And many of them did because they were promised citizenship. And in fact, during the what do you call it, the swearing in of the draftees of Filipino workers, right then and there they were given citizenship, okay, which gave them the ability to buy property, buy and own property, and also to, there's still anti-miscegenation laws, so but they could bring in wives from the Philippines, which would take place after the war. Now, the 1st Infantry Battalion of Filipino volunteers were activated in Camp San Luis Obispo. They were mainly integrated into segregated units of the 1st and 2nd Infantry Battalion. Now, this doesn't mean that Filipinos were only put in those regiments. Only those who volunteered. All the other Filipinos who were enlisted but didn't volunteer for those segregated regiments were incorporated in white units. Okay, there were about 7,000 volunteers, Filipino volunteers, into the U.S. Armed Forces. Meanwhile, Filipino members of the Filipino troops who were in the Philippines and escaped after the fall of Bataan, escaped to Australia, were integrated into the first reconnaissance battalion in Australia. 1,000 of them would be sent to the Philippines as spies and saboteurs and coast watchers. The 1st Infantry Battalion was sent to New Guinea and then to Leyte with General MacArthur for combat duty, but they were mainly relegated to mopping up operations, which were very dangerous, but they were not part of the landing necessarily. Public Law 360 let in the Filipinos to join the U.S. Armed Forces, giving U.S. citizenship. And after the war in 1946, around 7,000 Filipinos received U.S. citizenship. So that by 1940, there were 5,327 Filipino men were married. By 1950, this would increase to 17,616. This was listed by the census as married men. So that between 1946 and 1965, 33,000 Filipinos immigrated to the United States. 16,000 of them were so-called war brides, because the Filipinos who volunteered to fight and the Filipinos who were in Australia were given citizenship and were allowed to bring in wives. So many of them did. Even those who were not volunteers, but members of the first wave of immigration, would later be able to bring in wives because of the 1946 gave access to naturalization for all Filipinos who were in the United States before March 1934. So all those first wave had now the chance to, the thousands of them now had the chance to become U.S. citizens. And as a result, many of them also went back to the Philippines and brought in war brides. Now, the war also, the manufacturing boom, the industrial boom during the war also enabled the new citizens to get jobs other than agriculture, such as in manufacturing, in retail, in services. And because of citizenship, many of them were able to buy land and become small farmers. Now, the first wave, the second wave, however, were not just those who came for agricultural work or and later enlisted in the armed forces. It must be noted that the U.S. Navy had been recruiting Filipinos into the U.S. Navy since 1901. At that time, they could enlist, and depending on their skills, they could be enlisted in various ratings. But after the First World War, they were limited to enlisting as stewards to do menial work for officers and officials of the U.S. government, particularly in Washington. It was only in 1973 that Filipinos were allowed to join the Navy under any rating. Enlistment in the Navy ended in 1992 with the end of the closure of the U.S. Military bases of the United States in the Philippines. Now, I would consider members of this, the people who joined the U.S. Navy until 1965 as part of the second wave. Why until 1965, I will explain later. And they are mostly military-based families. So what you had was by 1914, 6,000 Filipinos were in the Navy. The Navy was recruiting 6,000 a year. In 1970, 17,000 were stewards. But even if the limits to the ratings were ended in 1973, 40% still remained as stewards. So until 1965, the Filipinos were still mainly employed by agriculture, even though a lot of opportunities in the workforce had been open to them. And then the military families that went through the Navy settled near bases like Hampton Roads in Virginia Beach, Pensacola, different parts of the United States. Now, being a large number of veterans being parts of the second wave and also being active members of the military, there were certain things that buffered them from the economic uncertainties in the United States, such as for men who stayed in the military, they could get PX benefits and medical care, housing. I would say that the military is the only socialist part of the United States. For U.S. veterans, they could buy they could get special loans to buy cars and houses. And citizenship also offered access to civil service jobs. So there was a more stability economically for the second wave of Filipinos. Now, by 1950, there were 122,707 Filipinos in the United States. And as I said, around 33,000 of them came between 1953 and 1965 as part of the second wave. Now, socio-cultural changes were brought by the second wave. No longer was the Filipino community mainly a bachelor society. This was now a family-based community. So instead of taxi dance halls, the activities were mainly coronation balls, box lunches, beauty pageants, etc. And the all-male Masonic clubs of the first wave began recruiting auxiliaries, women's auxiliaries, for their lodges. There were also veterans of foreign wars lodges. And pretty much the political and cultural, ideological situation in the United States, combined with the experiences of Filipinos during the Second World War. Uh, the second wave had a very, strange or unique sense of nationalism, which was upholding the interests of the Philippines and the United States. So it's a patriotism that's kind of unique to the Philippines at the time, to the Filipinos, because of gratitude for the American liberation of the Philippines. At the same time, their experience as members of the military. You had a fairly conservative community that emerged after the war, which actually probably gave the impression that the Filipinos were a model minority that didn't want to rock the boat. And that is essentially the consciousness that emerged in the second wave. And at that time, the left wing, I would say, of the Filipino community was under attack. The Walter McCarran Act called for the expulsion of undesirables. This was during the McCarthy period. And the most prominent first wave Filipino labor leaders were subjected to attempts at deportation, which failed, but there was a chilling effect on the Filipinos nonetheless. Now, the second wave, however, had an Achilles heel, which was the rise of the second generation, the baby boom generation. Even though their parents were Americanizing with a vengeance, especially after Americanization had been prohibited or stifled in the past, their children, for example, were encouraged not to learn the native languages, but speak American, be as American as possible. However, by the 60s, the conservatism was challenged because of the atmosphere also in the United States. The rise of the counterculture movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. Many of the, I would say a good segment of the second wave baby boomers were influenced by these political trends. And in fact, there started among them a so-called identity movement, which is to look for their roots, search for their roots and their identity, because they were Americans, but they were not quite considered as real Americans. They always came from somewhere else, from the point of view of the white majority. And they were born here. So a response to that was an identity movement, which led to the influence of leftism in many of the second wave baby boomers. I would say that a considerable part of this generation were liberals. Okay, let me see. Now, the third starting point is the Cold War. Now, the Cold War started really as early as 1944, or as early as the Potsdam meeting, as early as the first atomic bomb test. But why? But I will only start the third wave of immigration in 1965 because American immigration law was once again changed on that year. And it coincided with the Cold War policies of the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy doctrine was the containment diplomacy, containment of communism. There was a shift from Eurocentrism to more attention being paid to the developing world, as a result of which the Kennedy administration initiated the Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress in Latin America, and the slogan of "Make the World Safe for Democracy." There was an attempt to change it to "Make the World Safe for Diversity." So what happened was the Immigration Act of 1965. This ended the national racial origins preferences of U.S. immigration policy. Used to be mainly from Northern Europe. Immigrants from Northern Europe were encouraged to come. But this is mainly seen as a result of the civil rights movement. But I would also place it as part of the international diplomacy of the United States. Okay, the United States is friendly to all peoples of color or cultures. It also coincided with an economic need in the United States when hospitals, especially public hospitals, there was a shortage of staff. So during this period, the 1965 Immigration Act allowed the immigration based on skills and professions. So this is where you see the beginning entry of Filipino doctors, nurses, middle management, accountants, a distinct economic base also from the second and first wave. Okay. The Philippines was allowed a quota of 20,000 immigrants a year, which later on became 40,000. So Filipinos are immigrating, continuing to immigrate in large numbers, based essentially on this 1965 Immigration Act. Now, even though the preference for professions and skilled workers was closed in 1970, the reunification of families of those initial immigrants, the so-called anchor immigrants, continued. And every immigrant that becomes citizen can, there's a chain of immigration that continues to this day. So that, and there were also exchange visitors programs for nurses and doctors, even though they were no longer entering as part of the skills preference. But in the early period of, until the 70s, nurses and doctors on exchange programs are being encouraged by immigration to convert to immigrant type permanent residency status instead of going back to the Philippines. So there are now 3.4 million Filipinos in the United States, and the continued immigration mainly through family reunification. The multi-generational nature of the immigration means that it is diverse in terms of age, professions, skills. The median age is 49 years. 76% are of working age from 18 to 64. And 1 of 4 Filipinos live in Southern California. 43% of these 3.4 million live in California. But socially and culturally, they are different from the first and second waves, mainly having come in more modern times. It's very hard to classify them as all liberals or conservatives. I think the registration, party registration shows that Filipinos are still overwhelmingly Democrats, but also among Asian Americans, more Filipinos voted for Trump. So you can see a diverse mixture politically. So I will end my presentation there, and you can ask me questions.
Animism was also very much alive. In fact, the Spanish friars incorporated animistic beliefs into Catholicism. So that was also brought in. Still alive today. Also, I have to clarify, the restrictions on Filipinos were mainly enforced in the West Coast. Because in the East Coast, where there were fewer Filipinos, they became students, university students. Some of them became lawyers. So it was because mainly the Filipinos were on the West Coast that the restrictions were California-wide, and up to Oregon, and like that. So yes, please.
I was a little confused about the 20 million. Who sold and bought?
Oh, the United States sold the Philippines to Spain in the Treaty of Paris. Bought the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. And that also included Puerto Rico in the bargain. So, which is weird because once the United States defeated the main force of the Filipino revolutionary forces and established the colonial government, there was still fighting going on. But the main forces had retreated, and then they proceeded with the Paris negotiations, the Paris Treaty. So that's why we say, the United States had no right to sell, and the Spain no longer had the right to, the United States had no right to buy, and Spain no longer had the right to sell, but it proceeded anyway.
Was there any, what happened when that happened? Was there any level of
Protest?
protest?
In the United States, during when the Philippine American War started, in the United States there was the Anti-Imperialist League that was founded. The most liberal wing of this, like Mark Twain and some other American tycoons, but were anti-imperialist because of moral concerns, moral values. But there was also members of this movement that were agricultural interests or racists who didn't want the stampede of Filipinos into the United States. So there was that protest, but it was not effective. It was important, but not effective enough. Yes.
This is more of a comment.
Uh-huh.
I'm very interested in your thought on this. I teach Asian American Studies at Fresno State College, and part of the dealing with Filipino Americans, as you said, the purchase of the Philippines by the United States. So President McKinley referred to the Filipinos as our little brown brothers. And so I usually ask my students this, if President McKinley was talking to you, would you be offended or not? And the students that raised their hand said they're offended. So I said, what are you offended by? Well, they said, well, we don't want to be called little, but more on the brown brother. And then, so I pointed out, well, I'm not sure exactly how tall President McKinley is, but I'm sure he's bigger than the average Asian person or Filipino person. So maybe like that. Because I think a lot of that deals with the concept of the white man's burden.
Yeah.
And if the European countries are expanding into the international scene, into the African continent and Asia, the British were going into India, they could say, yes, we're bringing our quote-unquote superior culture to you guys, but before we share our superior culture with you, we have to take political control, that type of thing. So, in a sense, that's kind of like similar to the U.S. thing over the Philippines, but as you mentioned, the part about benevolent assimilation that the Americans were bringing in their public schools and system. So I tell the students, well, if you're in the Philippines and you learn about things, okay, what are you going to learn about? Aren't you going to learn about the rights of free men? You know what I mean? And if you take this concept of we're equal, free rights and so forth, before coming into the Philippines, you have that type of concept. And since Spain had started to colonize the Philippines in the 1500s, you know what I mean? And so there was interracial mixing, similar as what happened in Mexico. And so it says, if they're coming into the United States, isn't there going to be a lot more willingness to mix, as that one picture you showed, with all the men and the white women in that picture? Way more so than, say, the Chinese and Japanese men who had come earlier than the Filipinos. And so this ties in with, say, on the thing. with the Watsonville riots and so forth, you know what I mean? As you mentioned at the Filipino dance hall. What started the riot? Just a picture of a Filipino man holding his white girlfriend. And that creates an outrage, and one person ends up being killed. The whole thing about the anti-miscegenation laws, that Salvador Dali had his case because he had married a white English woman, and he says California law prohibited marrying with white people with Negro, mulatto, or Mongolians. I don't think there are any Mongolians in California.
Malayan, it was Malayan.
Yeah, but
Changed it, they modified it, added Malayans
yeah,
afterwards.
afterwards, Mongolians was.
So that's gonna be added in later, so kind of like your thoughts on tying with the, as a.
Well, a little brown brother was coined in the United States as a duty of the white man to uplift
Right,
the lesser, brethren.
okay,
So in the Philippines, though, I think the Americanizing intelligentsia viewed that with pride.
okay.
Okay, we're little, they consider us brothers. It was only later in the re-examination of Philippine American history that the offense, the later generations would take offense. And also the communication, the mass communication between the Philippines and the United States at the time, or the world, was not as instantaneous as it is today. If the Filipinos saw how Filipinos were being depicted in the United States, I think even the intellectuals would take umbrage. Because the cartoons, there are many political cartoons in the early years, very few photographs, or the photography was still developing. First, because the Americans didn't have any, including the media, had very little notion of what Filipinos look like. First, the cartoons depicted Filipinos as African Americans. They just interchanged the figures, Then later, earlier as apes, then as African Americans, then as Native Americans, then finally as Malayan looking. So, but very little of those actually were disseminated in the Philippines, mostly here. Yes, please.
I was wondering if there were any broad cultural or immigration shifts to those as a result of the 90s, the base closures of the 1990s.
There was no big shift because there was no new policy after the 1965 change of law that significantly altered, let's say, the preferences or, So what you see today are still the 40,000 a year are mainly the chain of immigration, reunification in family history, like that. That's why some conservative American officials, legislators, want to restrict the anchor, the chain reaction, by limiting the immigration to the anchor, and that's it. So Trump would like, even it went as far as not accepting grandparents, or So.
I have two questions.
Yes.
One was just a reminder of how many Filipinos fought in World War II, and then the other question, I've seen letters from Black American
Yeah.
soldiers about the racist kind of anti-Black way that Filipinos were talked about in terms of the insults used even over there during the Spanish American War. But what I was wondering was about the relationship of Black soldiers and Filipino women in terms of anti-miscegenation laws, or the African American community and Filipino community historically here in California, or just anything, any sources or any more information on that.
Right. Well, during the Philippine American War, the Buffalo Soldiers were sent to the Philippines.
Yeah.
The Buffalo Soldiers were the African American soldiers, Indian fighters And then they were sent to the Philippines to fight the insurrection. A few of them, however, defected to the Philippine side. A few became notorious and were hunted down by U.S. authorities. I think there's a book called, Buffalo Soldiers, and I don't exactly know the title, but and some of them stayed in the Philippines after the Philippine American War and intermarried and started families. Evangeline Buell is a well-known Filipino American writer who's still alive, still around, and she's.
Her book,
Her book,
Filipinos of the East Bay, talks about the Buffalo Soldiers.
Yeah.
It's a whole chapter.
her father was a Buffalo soldier.
Grandfather.
Grandfather, she's too young. Yeah, okay. And the other is, okay, in the Second World War, the African Americans were in segregated units.
Yeah.
So there was little interaction between African Americans and Filipino soldiers during the war. And I think a lot of the African Americans were also sent to Europe. Red Ball Express and that, some tank units. But on the whole, Filipinos are also infected by racism. Especially if you were Americanizing with a vengeance, then you incorporate the dominant influences would include racism. So that's why the emergence of the second generation, baby boom, was very important to at least mitigate some of the backward influences in the Filipino community. To look at racial relations differently than their parents did. Yes?
I have a question on maybe.
I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. Then
Yeah.
I'm curious about the influence of, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm curious about the influence of Filipinos in politics, American politics. And I'm also interested in the effect and influence of fraternal and religious organizations on how folks vote.
Okay. In terms of, in general, the Filipino influence in American politics is just beginning to emerge. Unlike, let's say, African American or Latino community, even Chinese communities. My own take on this is that it is the result of the racism in the first wave. Because many of the first wave in general wasn't able to establish communities, and second generations and third generations. The bulk of Filipino presence in this country really just started in 1965. So it's a fairly young community. It didn't have until citizenship was allowed, didn't have the ability to have second, third generations that would establish themselves as Americans and establish influence as an American group, as an American minority group. It would have been different. It would have been different. Right now in California, we only have one member of the Assembly, Rob Bonta. After years of being here, and if you look back to 1903, several years of being here. So why? And that, to me, that's the reason. There would have been several more Rob Bontas if the first wave had extensive second, third generations. Hold on, and then the other one is.
Yeah, mine is just a history question, and I'm not sure if you're the one to speak to it, but the difference in the relationship between the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and all these places that the United States was looking around, we end up with Hawaii as a state, Puerto Rico is territory, Philippines has this. Would you just speak a little bit about what engendered that difference and how it affected immigration?
Well, okay, what engendered the difference between, I would say distance is one important, probably the most important feature.
Hawaii and Philippines.
No, Hawaii is halfway to the Philippines. And the Philippines is just too far. Even though there were colonially minded Filipinos up to the 1970s who wanted to become a state of the United States. There was a campaign for the Philippines to become an American state. Because you don't longer have to immigrate, you're already there. Anyway, but you know, it fizzled out. It wasn't, even for Filipinos, it was very impractical. You know, I don't know about Puerto Rico. I'm sorry to say why Puerto Rico ended up, you know, being more of still a colony, formally, you know, a protectorate, whatever. Who else? Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt this, but to keep us on schedule,
Yeah.
we're due for a break right now.
Okay.
Renee's going to be part of the panel in the afternoon, so you can continue to ask him questions then. If you want to write them down on sticky notes,